copy, we are go to come back on board. And with that, you are go to perform sections 1 through 3, 4 to 400. We do recommend deferring your step 2.1, the way to flush, so closer to hatch opening. Section 3,
I'm making you host.
Your inventory, please collect all your food and water bottle trash. Consolidate it into the 2 trash bags within their common.
I think people would like to see who is presenting today. So you shouldn't hide your face, Mr. Oloo.
I think I'm still. Am I? Oh, I'm using the wrong audio, the wrong videos, right? I should just change that. Video.
Yeah, I know a lot of people hiding their faces. Okay.
It's good. Right.
Yeah. Yeah, we can all see. So I think we within 2 minutes, it should start. But you can basically introduce yourself, your background, what you do. So anybody with a noise in the background, try to mute. Yeah, who has noise in the background? Can you please mute? Okay.
You're looking good in the for someone who's in lockdown. Look, you're looking good. Seems like you're getting your hair cut off and all that.
Some things you learn over time. You learn how to shave your hair. You learn to shave your beard. Yeah. Things you. So now we have a couple of people. So far, 11 people have joined. So other people are going to be joining. I see my friend Kincha, Patrick.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, so those who are hiding your faces, I can't say hi. Sorry. Yeah, so Solo, you can start.
All right, let me just get to sharing my screen fast. I do want to get this. All right. Can you folks see my screen? Any chance?
Yes.
All right. Let me take this away. All right, do you still see it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm James Oloo Onyango. I live out in San Francisco. I've been living here about 5 years now. I'm a senior software engineer at Netflix. Yeah, so coding is my life. I studied and grew up in Uganda, did all my education in Uganda, moved here with a different company, and then transitioned to Netflix. Yeah. The reason as to why I thought this talk was useful might be for 2 groups of people: those who are considering changing to software and just having a sense of what's the landscape like, what does it mean, or if you feel that the ship has left and you want to advise people who are coming after you, let's say a younger sibling or your kids or whatever. I think you'd be more equipped to point them in the right direction and have a sense of what's actually available out there. Right. If you do have a particular pointed question about what I'm going over, do stop me and ask. But if it's something general, then we'll have some bit of time at the end for you to ask questions. All right. All right. So areas of focus about software development. What is it? What roles exist in that space? What's the opportunity landscape like, and how can I get in? Those are the 4 things I want to explore with you folks this next hour. So there are very many definitions of what software development is, and based on the style in which people are actually developing stuff. There's one extreme side, which is agile, where they believe in being very continuous about what they do. Define something, build it, test it, get feedback, rinse and repeat. Then there's on the other extreme of the spectrum, whereby people do the design of things very early on. Everything is rubber stamped and signed like a contract. People build things and then finally test. And it's not a one size fits all. If you're building medical equipment, you had best believe that people have tested things out whereby let's say the software that's controlling the medical equipment has been tested thoroughly and people have gone through that rigorous process. But if I'm building for an app like TikTok, it's better and faster for me to put something out in the hands of the users and get feedback quickly, as opposed to me waiting a year to have built anything that's useful. So in a nutshell, it's a process of conceiving, building, and maintaining software. I'll get into the details of each of these in a bit. So I put things juxtaposed in terms of the traditional thinking versus the new thinking. Requirements analysis. More broadly speaking, this is product conception, and I'll give you an example. Whoever came up with TikTok right now, someone had to sit down something like, you know what? It makes sense for us to have short form videos, which is user created content, which is different from YouTube because it's easier to load and people can scroll through easily enough. Then they do some basic projections. They'll go out and do some user testing with some ideas. They ask, a panel of people, does this make sense for us to build? If you can go down to mockups, even sometimes they show you something, oh, does this look good to you? And they do some quick user testing. And then they figure out, what, these 10 features we thought we should build, people only want to see 6. And they get down to specifying what those 6 are. Now, there are multiple individuals involved in this phase here, and I'll get into the details of it in a bit. But eventually they're like, oh yeah, we're going to have an app which will be able to add videos. You can follow people. We'll be able to advise people on content based on our algorithms and allow people to chat, right? That's the MVP, which is what they call the minimum viable product, the first version out there. Now, with that thinking, they work with some of the people in the software design and architecture phase. Now here it's like, oh yeah, you have an idea. What do we need to build? Does it make sense to have it as a website or an iOS and Android app? That decision has to be made. If it's iOS and Android, which kind of video encoding are we going to allow to be using? How do people register? If the app is offline, how do you deal with that? Do you need to store things on the phone versus only in the cloud? There's so many things that get into this phase here, but they have a blueprint of what they're going to build. At the end of this phase, which is supposed to be continuous, but some people do it very short form, it becomes a case of, hey, we are going to build an Android and an iOS app will not have a website, and people will be able to sign up using their Google accounts and Facebook. Now, the other part, which people typically call software development, is people writing the code for it, right? So I'll go on my IDE and write up some code in any language of choice, depending on what's useful. And the final artifact is something which someone can download to the App Store or Google Play Store. So that's that phase which people focus on a lot, but in truth, building software, this is actually a very short phase in comparison to some of the others, especially the one I'll come down to. Testing. Traditional testing, of course, is manual testing, right? Someone is like, oh, you say you've built this app this way. Does it do what you say it do? It does, right? Then they look for boundary conditions. If I upload a file which is more than 1 gigabyte, does it work? Do I get a message? So they figure out corner cases to make sure the quality of whatever you're having is good. In truth, people in this phase are actually involved from much earlier on in terms of, based on the requirement defined, they help to suss out how quality can be embedded at different levels. So those are the folks who do that. Deployment, of course, ultimately these things need to be deployed somewhere. If it's an app, of course, you have Android Store, the Play Store, and the App Store. But if it's on some server somewhere, someone has to actually make sure they're ready for the app, all the necessary stuff is installed. You could have individuals doing it, or the team can manage doing it themselves. So you find people wearing multiple hats. Then, of course, maintenance and support. Interestingly, for any successful application, this is the longest phase. If it's a crap one, it will disappear. You've taken 6 months to 1 year building it. Yes, you may be adding features or fixing bugs, but that phase is very important. And the decisions you made in the earlier steps inform how much time and expense and success truly this phase will have, right? So that's a very big phase which no one ever considers when not one, but most people actually do a poor job of considering, based on some mistakes they made before, and they didn't know that a chunk of their budget is going to be spent in this phase here. And finally, sunsetting, retirement. Everything gets out of fleek, right? Over time, something gets out of fleek. And it could be outright retirement or a revamp, whereby it's a rebuild. So the users may not see much in front, like in terms of the UI, but things are changing underneath. So retiring stuff has to be part of the plan. And you have to sense check over time. Is this thing still worth it? If you're putting in more money than you're getting out of it, it may be time for you to upgrade to newer patterns, newer ways of working, on adapting to what users need right now. Sorry, there's a bit of a. I'm going to mute someone.
Yeah.
Yes. All right. So the different roles. I'm trying to map out the roles based on what steps are just defined for you, and I added a small statement that this person would typically make as they're building things. So product managers and business analysts. Now, there's a bit of conflation of what these two things mean, but ideally product managers handle a huger chunk of the conception of ideas all the way to seeing that it's successful, as opposed to business analysts who distill the ideas into requirements that they can give to a developer. Now, a typical statement from a product manager would be, we need to add a story section at the top of the Instagram app. We can include ads there to bring in revenue, right? So ultimately, your product needs to have some value. For most of the companies you work for, it has to translate to direct monetary value, user retention, customer retention in that sense, or attracting new users or different demographics. There has to be something that's advantageous to it, or simplifying the way those users interact with the system. So that is their scope. They think about those things, and they map out what the users need in terms to the people who are actually going to build it. Cool. This is project program manager. Now, we like to call this herding cats. It's like herding cats. Ultimately, software development is less similar to engineering than it is to gardening. And the reason for that is engineering is very precise in terms of what steps are there. Things have been tried and tested for hundreds of years, like in civil engineering, for example. In software engineering, software development, actually, I prefer not to use the engineering term in there. It's mostly about gardening, whereby you get surprises. You'll get weeds coming up. Users will change their minds mid-flight. Servers will drop for any particular reason. You'll have people leaving the team. All those things kind of are in flux, and you need someone who's actually planning things out and making changes along the way as you learn more. So a typical project program manager would make a statement like, to execute this project, I think we'll need about 10 developers, a business analyst, and a tester. We should be able to finish in 6 months and maybe with $1 million. Now, this is a traditional program project manager. Others do a good job of chunking things out into small milestones, and you learn from there. So you never commit to the full 6 months, but for the next 2 weeks, which they typically maybe call an iteration, we will build these 6 features, put them out there, and see what we learn. Yeah. This is, I think, if you to pick out one role that is the most familiar for most folks, it's the software developer, right? Software developer, some of them go by software engineer, coder, there are different terms for it. But these are people who actually build the app in terms of writing the code for it. So based on the design I was given, I can build a new search bar to allow Facebook users look for friends based on city. I will have this in test tomorrow. That's a statement they would make. So a product manager thought of this idea because users were asking for it. He got someone to draw the designs, and I'll talk about that individually in a bit, like, oh, it should look like this so the users can use it easily. And they hand that over to this person here, and the developer will actually write the code for it. So architects, tech leads, this is a little more gray, because there are times when it's a full-blown individual who does nothing else other than architecture. Other times it's someone who's considered a technical lead who wears 2 hats. Most of the time they're a developer who also takes a chunk of their time to be a technical lead. So they take that backseat thinking and figure out, hey, based on this, which direction should we go? How should we build this? That decision around making it a mobile app or website is in conjunction with the product managers, and they bring the technical thinking about it. If it's much easier to build a website to get it out there in front of users, get feedback, and then you build a mobile app later, then they'll surface that information to the right people, and they make a business decision based on what I've said. So, like in this case, they would say, I wrote up a document on the merits of using Java, which is a programming language instead of Python for this new project. My developer team agrees, so we'll do analysis at the end. And this could be like a directional thing whereby the company is moving from one technology to the other. These are the folks who worry about those things.
Yes, Oloo, can you, I don't know if everybody is hearing you. Is everybody hearing Oloo clearly? Does he need to speak louder, or you guys are good?
He's good.
I'm okay. I can hear him.
Okay.
I can hear him. He's good.
Yeah, he's good. Yeah.
Okay.
Awesome. Thanks for checking for that. All right. So tester, software engineer, engineering test, quality analyst, it's a mouthful. These are folks who have traditionally done manual testing. They'll sit down, have a scheme to follow for every version being released. They'll go through their different steps of testing, like enter these values. If it's, let's say, in this case, I'll just read out what this person said. I was testing the search feature on the app, and the app first closes, which means it just, closes. Each time you type a statement longer than 100 characters. I filed a bug with the developers to get this fixed. Now, that is typical testing, typical manual testing. This role has evolved whereby some of these folks in test actually write code that automates that process. So it will, instead of them taking 2-3 days after you build features, they can run part of the general process is to run their scripts to actually run through the tests very fast and give feedback quickly. So it's kind of like a transitional role which has changed over time, and it's one of those I found people find easy to get into as a first step in the software space. Cool. We've had a survey of the different roles out there, what software actually is like. So the next question is about what is the opportunity landscape? Let's say you are sold off on what I've mentioned. They're like, I might make a good product manager, but is there a role for me out there? What does it look like? If let's say I go and get my training, will I wind up with no job, right? So those are very valid questions I think we should ask ourselves if you're trying to move into a different space. I just copied a statement off of the Bureau of Labor Statistics to give you a sense of what the current shortfall is. By 2026, there will be 1.2 million openings, barring any major economic shifts as we're experiencing right now, than the 545K which are left in the market right now. As of 2020, a newer report about the state of what things currently are. As of 2020, the 2019 report said there's actually 1 million right now. So there's a ton of jobs out there. There is no shortage. If you do have the skills, you will not be unemployed. This is a very, it's a controversial one because every report you see has a ton of very different salaries for people to see in terms of expectations. I've seen anywhere between 100 and 300K as median for San Francisco, for example. So take them with a pinch of salt. I chose the ones which reflected what I have seen, at least what I know from individuals I've interacted with. Yeah, so, and the medians, interestingly, if you look at the curve of the salaries, it's such that there's a huge spread across from the median. So the standard deviation is super high. So you'll find, while in the Bay Area, a typical software engineer, let's say with 4 years of experience, will make 140,000. But there's a ton of them who are going to make 300,000, 400,000, 500,000. And you'll find some who are making 70, 80. Ordinarily, though, it's not a very uniform curve. There are not very many who are below 70,000 in the Bay Area, for example. So generally speaking, in the higher cost of living areas, it's lucrative to be in software, but even better in the lower cost of living areas. I'll give you an example. Like in Houston, I worked there for a while, and about $100,000 is a lot of money compared to $140,000 in San Francisco. It's way more. It will translate to close to 2x actually in the Bay Area. You need about 200,000 in the Bay Area to have the same standard of living as someone with 100,000 in Houston. So this is general to give you a sense that the money is decent. I don't think there are very many other professions which pay this well at this point in time.
Okay.
Cool. This is where it gets interesting in terms of what to go through. And I do want to actually, I'm going to unmute folks. Do feel free to ask me questions about this so we can actually address them one by one, right? So there's a formal route to getting into software development, whereby you're actually going off, taking some time off your normal job, either going full-time into education or doing it part-time, and it will take typically 2 to 4 years. Now, I will start by saying, unless you're advising someone who's fresh out of high school and wants to do something and is deciding on which career pathway to take, or you have a ton of money saved somewhere and you can afford to do full-time education, this is probably not something I'd propose for people to do. But you can go with a part-time route. Now, ordinarily, any kind of distance learning education while you're having your full-time job still going in the software space has been super expensive. I'll give you an example. I know that University of Washington will set you back $40,000 per year in fees alone. If you're doing Berkeley extension, that would be what, $35,000. If you're doing MIT has, interestingly, Harvard has a master's in liberal arts in information technology. So they make it a point not to call it a computer science master's, but even that will set you back $45,000 in the 2 years that you'll be doing it. So it's been very expensive up till the advent of MOOCs. So these open platforms for open courses really revolutionized things, which is why I want to highlight these two particular degrees. So I think it was 2016 when Georgia Tech, in conjunction with Udacity, announced an under $7,000 master's program, which will be running on the Udacity platform. And that changed a bunch of things. I'm personally enrolled in this right now. I find it nice. It's super challenging, but it's still also rewarding. And you choose the times when you have the time and the money to enroll. So you pay as you go, unlike some other courses whereby you have to pay upfront for everything. So it's a nice one. There are others like this, and if you are interested, feel free to reach out to me and I can compile a list based on the research I did for myself for this. And that's, yeah, and I'll definitely share that. I highlighted the second one, which is the University of London Bachelor of Computer Science, because it's online. It's from a very well reputable university. It's on Coursera, actually. It'll set you back 10, 15,000 pounds, but it works well for folks who have no experience coming into the software space. So it's a very good bridge in that regard. I do know about 3 people who are doing this right now, and they're fully rewarding. One of them is in their second year, the other one is finishing up their third year. I think that one is still in the first year, but they're fully useful, and to them, it's an easy way to do your education. You can pay for it, and then you start to engage in some of the things I'm going to highlight in the informal education section. So the takeaway, at least if you take anything away from this part here, it's formal education is an option, and if you learn better in that setting, well and good. Be ready to invest quite a bit of time before you get the huge payouts, and spending quite a bit of money as well. All right.
What do you want?
Sorry, I'm going to have to mute. Okay. All right. Informal education. I'll start by telling you about my journey into the software development space. So in my career, I did electrical engineering, which, as opposed to what most people think, because most people assume that electrical engineering and software engineering or software development are very similar. They are not. I had one programming course during that time, which was in BASIC. So the language was not useful at all. No one ever uses it. And frankly, our lecturer was surprising, well, not surprising, but quite incompetent. So we didn't actually learn much. Most people never got time to actually write code in a computer. So in that regard, it was as though I was coming from a very different course with no experience. And my journey was very similar to what I'm going to line out here. I started out with doing some side learning. I got a book, it seemed interesting. I borrowed a laptop, played around with some few things. I had a couple of friends who were into it. So it gets very social in that regard. Some friends who are doing this involved me during my campus days. And I started learning online. Now, the material out there has changed so much in the last 10, 15 years. 15 years ago, you'd have to have a book, right? You have to go to Aristoc in Uganda and buy a physical book and learn through that. fast forward a little later, there was some information online, but it was highly regulated and was hard to find and not very consumable. So it seemed like arcane knowledge. It was still accessible in terms of physical access, but arcane in terms of how it was being presented. That has changed over time with the likes of Coursera, edX, Udemy. Now you can go onto Coursera and sign up for a specialization in software development, which will tell you everything from the beginning. Assume that you have zero experience, and you could pay for a paid version, which is about $50 a month, or the unpaid version. So all that's going to cost you is your time. So that's at least personally, that was my journey. I just learned a couple of things. That was, a winding path that got me here. Interestingly, none of my employers has ever asked for my academic credentials. And that is one thing I find that the software development space is very different from. Google ran a survey about 6 years ago, because previously they had software developers targeting particular schools. So think Ivy League, and some of the top universities. Now, after a couple of years, their HR ran a survey to figure out of the candidates we got from those not so good colleges, or maybe not even a college degree, how are they performing in comparison to the ones they recruited from MIT, from Harvard, from UPenn. And it turns out that there was zero correlation between formal education and which schools they went to how they're performing and getting their promotions and all that at work. So it started changing people's mindsets in that space, and to a point that, now when I interviewed with Netflix, at no point did they ask for my degree. It was all about what can you do, what have you done, and how do you work well with people. So more and more I find informal education is the best route, unless you do have the time and you're at a point in your life where you can actually go and do the degree. So I'd like to go through each of these in terms of what they give you and what, I guess, how they compare to other bits. I will highlight though that probably you need to have a combination of 3 or 4 of these things as you go through your journey. So if you to start out, some people would start out with a MOOC platform. So you go to Coursera, like, hey, I want to do a specialization to learning software development, right? You pay your $50 per month because you'll get a certificate at the end of it, which will give you some sort of achievement and all that. Now, while that's great, there's a varying level of complexity and usefulness of those specializations. Thankfully, there's a ton of people have done a ton of analysis in terms of people's feedback, so they can recommend to you which ones. I personally know a couple in Coursera, which then I can share with folks who are interested in knowing which ones I think are useful to start off with. So there's Coursera, edX, Udemy. There's a bunch of MOOC platforms you can pick from. I find Coursera to be the best, or Udacity is one of them as well. I find Coursera to be the best if the platform is well suited for this kind of work, where it's easy for you to submit your work, get it checked either by peers, and get very useful feedback coming back to you. Typically, those specializations run anywhere from 3 to 9 months, based on what you pick. So it's fairly involved. My advice would be, after you've gotten your feet wet 2-3 months in, you maybe want to start involving yourself in some other things I'm going to go over further down the list. Bootcamps. I have intentionally not listed a single bootcamp here, because all of the ones I have seen people go to, and also just reading based on people's feedback, has been very mixed. So if you do land on one which you feel confident in, it makes sense. Now, the typical structure of bootcamps has been one of 2 ways. When they realized that companies didn't really care much for people having formal education in the software space, bootcamps sprouted. Of course, they saw an opportunity and they've capitalized. And because of that capitalization, there's zero quality control, which I mean has been a detriment to the industry. So a bunch of the first couple of a huge chunk of the first bootcamps actually had physical bootcamps, like you'd have to go every day to a particular place. They'll charge anywhere from $3,000 to $20,000, and then take you through a very rigorous program. There's an actual bootcamp where 8 hours a day you're doing a whole bunch of things and going through them in that regard. Of course, people caught wind of this, and employers started realizing that some of these bootcamps weren't doing very well in terms of the quality they're imparting the quality they're imparting on, the quality of education they're giving. So it's been shaky, it's gone up and down. A few have survived and they're fairly decent, and some of them are now online. I mean, right now they have to be online, but some are actually generally online for a much smaller fee. So those are the ones you might want to look at, which is a little more structured, and you augment it with your personal work as well. There is another segment of bootcamps that has sprouted in the last 3 years, which is around interview bootcamps. So their job is to get you to a point that you can pass software development interviews. Those are highly suspicious if it's all you do, because it's basically like you're cramming for an exam, only the content that they believe is going to come in the exam. And you might, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you look at it, you might pass the exam and get into the workplace, but you will not have the tools to succeed. And the better the company, the higher the bar in terms of your performance to stay there. So bootcamps, I'll put an asterisk there. I'll actually jump down to internships next, because turns out some companies have internship programs, and yes, we are people of color, and it would be taking advantage of it. And I mean, why not, right? If you have opportunities whereby they're trying to diversify their workforce, they are getting people in for paid internships while they're learning. So basically, you are a trainee for a while, you're learning on the job, and if things go well, in 6 months, a year, 2 years, you'll be moving through the ranks comfortably. This I find has been useful, mostly because most internship spots, they used to reserve for university students or college students. Let's say in their summer they'll get summer internships. So there's good companies and move along. But more recently, they're opening up they're opening it up a little more, so different folks can apply for internships. Yeah. So it's one thing to look out for. Right now, because of the landscape we're in, most of the internships I know about have been canceled, and some of the interns who are actually being invited have been, those internship awards have been revoked. So it's not a good time for it, but I imagine in the next 6 months or so, this will be sprouting up again. All right, so those 3 things, the MOOC platform, the bootcamps, internships, are good starting points. Most likely, before you go for an internship, you should at least be able to either write 3 lines of code or do some product management thinking. You have to have started that bit, right? But for the first 2, you can come from zero. Now, when you've gone along your learning journey a bit, these next 2 things come up, and I can't overemphasize the usefulness of them in terms of how quickly you grow, because we've seen people get into the software space, but they stay beginners for 1 to 2 years, as opposed to someone else who will come in later, but quickly ramp up and get promoted in a year or 2 into much higher roles. And that's because of these 2 things. So the networking and people showing you different tricks, tools are way more important. All the jobs I've gotten have been because of referrals, not because of, but I got my foot in the door because of referrals from people I'd worked with before. So it's extremely important to be involved in local group meetups. Right now, they're all online, but there's a ton of them in every major city for every user group you can think of. There's a ton of those. Open source involvement and personal projects. So most times, if you're to be successful in the software space, particularly in the roles of software developer, test engineer, and of course, architect, tech lead, self-motivation to learn on your own is super important. Actually, if you don't do it, you will lag behind and easily become obsolete. So that's a big one. Carving out time to do your personal projects and personal learning is important for our survival and in the software space. And that's because, unlike many other vocations or fields like medicine or other traditional engineering, things here move extremely fast. There's a running joke that in JavaScript, which is one of the languages, each time you go to bed and wake up the following day, there's a new platform, there's a new framework, because they come out so fast. So you have to keep learning, keep on top of things to stay relevant. So that's important. Open source is a big one because it's a very learning by doing space. And I mean, personally, my involvement in open source with OpenMRS, which is a medical records capturing tool that's deployed in a bunch of places, including Uganda, is such that, one, I want to give back in a sense, but also the things you learn from people are way more willing to teach you things if it is to allow you to accomplish some tasks on open source. And it doesn't have to be you starting by building features, right? Some of it starts with documentation. Can you look through all the app works and document the steps? And you kind of get a sense of what's the terminology. Someone else will read your document and give you advice, feedback, and that's kind of like it's a way into that space. So it has a much lower barrier to entry for different folks to actually get involved. So over time, as you're trying to explore things, there's a ton of starter open source projects where they mark some things as starter for you to ease in, and they'll they're very good at hand holding to let you get into the space. Local group meetings, as I said, I've already gone through. Cool. I did want to leave a chunk of time, about 20 minutes, for us to have discussions, for you folks to ask questions. So this is where I'm going to cap this. I'll mention that the things which I said about, if you do want more information, do let me know. Do ping me privately and I'll share that information in the group. Cool. Right, that's it. Now, open to questions.
Okay, thank you, Oloo Onyango, for this great presentation. So, if I may ask one question, what are the most prominent programming languages there that somebody should focus on, that are more selling in the software industry and easier to learn?
Okay, so let me first unpack that, because you asked a couple of things there, right? So before I ask about popular programming languages, one thing you'll realize, like after your first year of programming, the expectation is that you can pick up any programming language and be successful with it. So it's one of those things where when you learn one, it's very easy to pick up the next. It'll take me 1 to 2 weeks to pick up another one. So that's the expectation they have. And more when people are doing interviews, they allow you to freely pick whichever programming language you feel comfortable with. So while you're exploring this, if I say this is more popular than the other one, doesn't mean you have to go off and learn this one instead of the other. So having said that, let me start with what's the easiest one to learn. Right now, Python and JavaScript are the easiest ones to learn, just because they have simpler syntax, they're more malleable in terms of how you can use them. I don't want to get into the technical terminology, but Python and JavaScript are the easiest. And you'll find that most of the, let's say, the MOOC platforms and specializations which are beginner use Python as a language of choice for that very reason. So there's a good chance you end up using Python and or JavaScript. Now, in terms of popularity, Java right now is lingua franca in the software space for many roles, unless you are in a particular niche, like if you're writing iOS apps, which uses a particular language like Swift or Objective-C back in the day. So you'll find those three which I just mentioned, JavaScript, Python, Java. If you know any one of those, you can comfortably go to a job interview and express your skills, unless you're going for a very niche interview.
Okay. Anybody with a question?
Hi, I got one. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Hey, okay. My name is David. I'm also in software development, and my question was more about when you get into an organization, what are some of, I guess, advice or tips on mentorship? You know, how to find good mentors, and how to, I guess, not rank, but gain more skills.
Cool. So the first question, so you're getting in, you have your foot in the door, you've gone past that, but you want to find a mentor, right? My experience has been getting 2 mentors. Now, you want a technical mentor whereby you want to build your skills up, your core skills, right? So let's say you want to branch into architecting and be a better system design person, like knowing system design better. The individuals who will mentor you, and it's most people actually very open to mentoring you, but there are 2 things that happen. One, them actually having the time to do it, because chances are they're busy people. And 2, of course, you picking the right person. What I found is you taking initiative in terms of something you're trying to do. Let's say if you're building a system and there's a new feature set coming up, and you taking initiative to write up a design doc, let's say, and send it to someone who has the time who knows their stuff. So that particular mentor is a technical mentor. It doesn't matter who they are in terms of personality as much, but more their technical skills. And they'll make time for people who have who have taken initiative. So in that case, it's that first mentor would ideally be someone who's strong technically, and it's easy for you to figure that out in the organization. And most of them won't handhold and teach you stuff like, hey, I'll give you 1 hour every week to show you the ropes. No, they want to see initiative from you. If you have like a side project, like, hey, do you have 5 minutes to look at my code and give me some tips? I found that to be much more, a much better arrangement, and people are more willing to give time. And when it was flipped and I've had to mentor some people in that regard, I first committed to mentoring people, thinking I had the time, but my interest was wavering because many of them did not have the initiative. And I realized I gave way more time to folks who had some initiative and had something for me to look at in that regard. So that's the one mentor. Now, what I found is as you grow in the software space, your technical skills, the need for you to be technically strong goes up to a point. And other things like your soft skills, like your leadership skills, your communication skills, those things now tend to become more important. Like, I'll give an example. For example, Netflix has only one level of engineers. Everyone is a senior engineer, right? But Google, for example, you have beginning engineer, like they have level 3, level 4, then senior, then staff, then senior staff. All the staff and senior staff I've worked with have the same technical chops as the senior engineers. But what differentiates them now is their technical skills. Sorry, their soft skills, their communication skills, their ability to convince people, their persuasive, like skills of persuasion. What I found is for that other mentor, it's usually easier to have an engineering manager or even a product manager at a high enough level to be a mentor in that regard, because those are the skills that are very important for them even at the get-go. And those folks are typically more in tune with how to chunk out their time and carve out time for you. So you actually just walking up to someone like, hey, I really want to grow my soft skills in this regard, my communication, my writing skills, technical writing in this case. Do you have time? You'll find most of them are more than willing, and actually, frankly, surprised a bit, because most of the time engineers are snobbish, software developers are a bit snobbish and downplay the importance of those skills. But it is a differentiating factor for you, and trying to find those two mentors in the space will probably have you move up really fast.
Thank you.
Any more questions?
Yeah, Oloo, can you talk about the skills needed to become a product manager?
Oh yeah, so I'll first caveat start by saying I am not an expert product manager by any stretch. I dabbled in it for a while, but I'm no expert at it. But from the product managers I've worked with, what I see are their strong suits are, one, being able to do user research. That's very important. User research, depending on which kind of products you're building. Now, there are two kinds of product managers, by the way. There are those who are B2B or internal, like business to business or internal, who are building tools and systems for users inside, right? For users in the business. Now, those folks have an advantage in terms of access to the users and getting quick feedback. And of course, just the sheer size of it, right? So the skills you need for that in that regard is more your communication, your your ability to persuade, your ability to think about usability and all those other things for those users. Now, the external facing product managers who, let's say a product manager for Facebook in terms of the app itself, which you use, there's a ton of them, of course. The skills they need in terms of figuring out what the users want is very different. They should be able to do projections and figure out what are the market trends. Who are the other players in the space? What is the general, the social sentiment, for example? Those things come in very handy. So they're very soft skills in that regard, and it's very subtle, but being able to think about what would someone want to use, that sense of imagination is critical. Now, their planning has to be impeccable as well, whereby them being able to map things out based on what they know. If I want to release this app or this feature before this competitor, how much money are we bound to make? And of course, then collaboration with financial planners and all that. But for the external facing folks, there's a very clear tie between their job and revenue, say, or user retention, market segmentation. So those skills, understanding the market for them is a very big one. Now, of course, the other things come into play. How do they plan? How do they collaborate? How do they communicate? Being able to talk both technically to the technical team, but also in very simple terms, non-complex terms to users and to business or like higher ups to convince them to give you budget. is a funky one. I find that it's the most multifaceted role, and no two product managers you meet will be the same. But I think those are the key things. Can you communicate? Are you great at user research and product research? And your ability to work cross-functionally.
Okay.
Did I answer that for you?
You did, yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Next question. Okay, looks like people are still waiting to ask questions. So me, personally, I would like to ask another question as regards, I had an introduction with Ruby as a programming language. And there's also Ruby on Rails, which is a platform that was developed with using the Ruby programming language. So, and I know Ruby was developed by a Japanese professor. So in terms of its popularity, is there some kind of competition between the developers of these programming languages between different countries, i.e. US versus somebody developing a programming language in China or Russia? Even if it's easier friendly, is there some kind of cold war on which programming language should be out there and sell more? Or do you have any ideas on that?
Oh no. Yes, I do have ideas, and my answer is no. It doesn't factor in. The case of Ruby particularly, I think it was called something Yamamoto, the guy who built it. Then Ruby, and then DHH, as is affably known, built Ruby on Rails, which was wildly popular in about 2010 to 2015-ish. Now, how simple it is to work with Ruby was a great thing with it. So it's just a very nice entry-level language. It was one of the ones I used when I was starting out. The reason as to why I didn't mention it when I was listing the ones to come up is mostly because it lost a ton of popularity. Ruby on Rails was the biggest vehicle for Ruby, right? It was most people were using Ruby were building Ruby on Rails applications. And Rails is a monolith in terms of its general structure. Yes, you can carve it out into smaller apps, but it's a monolith. There's been a huge microservice movement starting about 2013, 2014, driven by a bunch of companies. And now it's what everyone is doing. They're building small services which are very small, self-contained, easy to replace, and all that. So Ruby, Rails, and by transaction, Ruby did not do a good job of that, of making that shift, in making their platform easy enough to work in microservices. That's kind of why they lost popularity. Now, Ruby and Python have been around for a while, by the way. Python, I think, since 1995, Ruby a little later, but not much later. And they kind of surged in popularity because of the DevOps movement and Rails for Ruby. Python has stuck around mostly because the scientific community adopted it for data scientists and all machine learning stuff. Python is great in that space. They've done a very good job. That, and along with the fact that they are great, it's really great for building tools. So any DevOps tools, most DevOps tools now are built using Python. That's why it's become lingua franca for people starting out. But in terms of who built it, where most people really don't care, unless someone says the Russians planted a virus in like in one of the frameworks they built, or like let's say the deployable for you to run your apps in some particular language, the Russians planted a bug. Barring something that's scary, people really don't care. They love easy to use language.
Okay. Okay. Another thing is if you want to get the slides, please share your emails in the chat. And do we have more questions?
Yeah, Oloo, how big is security in the software lifecycle development, like AppSec?
So not as big as it should be from my perspective. So back in the day, security-led testing was an afterthought, right? People would build stuff like, oh yeah, we need to secure this thing, slap in a user page somewhere, make sure you check for SQL injection and all that stuff. Over time, people are now starting to bake security as part of the process, right from the requirements. What does security look like? How do users log in? Do they need to log in every time or not? and it's kind of matched up and weighed against things like usability and all that. At least if you're capturing credit card information, what do we need to do? How, if a user's account is compromised, what do you need to do? It comes all the way from requirements down to the choice of language and architecture decisions. Do we need to secure this is data in situ or in transit going to be encrypted? There's a framework we do guard against things like SQL injection and all that. Like it's getting to a point whereby you have all that, to a point whereby some of the automated testing, which I talked about QA is doing, part of it is going through the OWASP top 10, if it's possible to probe for them as part of your deployment. In every deployment, to make sure you're not violating some stuff or writing some code that's easy to do, hijacks and all that. So it's some companies, some teams I've worked with are very good with that, and it's front and center of them, their thinking, right up there with the features they're building. So all the CFRs, the cross-functional things, that usability, maintainability, all that stuff, security is right up there in how it's supposed to be done. What I've found in some other companies now is, instead of having a security expert who acts more like a gatekeeper and a blocker, they're now enabling the teams on the advice of those security folks and having individuals become more security aware in terms of how they work. So yeah, so security is a big thing. I think AppSec is big. It's not big enough. And every so often we're reminded based on those huge leaks that you see every so often. But I think we have very quick amnesia as a community in terms of security. So as long as the SOTU has had that security bit, people stumble for a bit, make one or two changes, and then put it on the side.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah.
So is it mainly developers who do the security aspect, or is it people from the coming from a security background, from your experience?
I've seen both. So AppSec, so most of the time people split it into two, right? There's InfoSec, which goes all the way towards, in terms of policy, access policy, physical access, and all that stuff. I find people come from a security background do a very good job of that. Coming down to network security, that's their domain for the most part, I find. Now, the other parts of security where it's baked into the applications itself, the AppSec parts of it, I find developers find it easy to transition and acquire those skills. And I find there's been a ton of collaboration, right? So you'll find the security policy for the organization is set by people who are from the security space. Network security policy is how easy is it for you to communicate between these two different AZs, for example, or regions. When you're transporting data, it has to be encrypted. All that stuff, they help set up the policies and make sure the checks are done, right? But the security that's baked into the apps, developers become involved. And so security becomes less of a role and more of a concern for everyone. And everyone kind of fits in along the process in terms of what part they're contributing towards making sure everything is secure.
Cool, thank you so much.
Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have 5 minutes to go. Any more questions?
Yes, I've got one.
Yep.
Yes.
Hi, James. Thanks for the presentation. Mine, it's a bit of layman question. It's not really, regarding the open source involvement and personal projects. If I'm looking to have a personal project done on developing a software, is that something you can do, or you've got people that can do?
So so let's say you have an idea of an app you want to build, or some website, or whatever project it is. You're asking, is it something I can do, or at least know people who can do it?
Yes.
I'll give you my personal experience with side projects, paid for side projects. It's usually, and this is at least I'll give you a viewpoint from Uganda and then from what I've seen here. People tend to want to pay very cheap and change their minds along the way, especially back home. If you tell someone, oh, you want to build this app, and you're like, oh, it's going to cost you 5 million, they're like, it's too much money. Yet they will happily spend that amount, maybe 10x that amount, on something they see physically. So the value attachment to software is way less back home. Now, even over here, people do come up with rates, right? Like for every hour of my time, $50 or $100 or whatever number it is, and things move on. personally, I don't have the time for it because, to be completely frank, the rates at which someone would want to pay me for a side project does not warrant my time. That is a fact, and you'll find for very many good software developers in the US that is going to be the case. The rate at which you're willing to pay, you're better off going to an actual company to pay them to build for you what you want. That's the way I see it. Now, there's a pool of talent. Thankfully, software is an open space. There's a pool of talent in different countries. I know people have been successful with working with folks in Eastern Europe, folks in India, and by successful I mean like 5 out of 10. It's a gamble, right? They may completely not do what you want, or you may change your mind halfway and then you're running over budget, or the concept itself just is running too long. So I found people who are much cheaper and have been successful with dealing with those teams. But you'd have to have a sense of what your budget is and what you're going to build. I can chat with you offline just to give you some pointers in terms of people who have been super useful in that, been successful trying to do that. I know about 2 people who have run some projects like that, but all of them run over budget by 25, 30,000 at least.
Yes, Oloo, can you share your contacts in the chat, your email or whatever contacts you wish people to contact you in case they have other private questions?
Yes. Should I do it here, or are more folks in the WhatsApp group? I don't know what's easier.
No, on the chat, because there are
Yes,
some people who are not basically on all the WhatsApp groups I share
yes.
information.
I'm sharing my contacts now.
Yeah.
Cheers, thank you.
Yeah, it's just in the chat.
Cool.
Yeah, so we have 1 minute to go. So
I'll drop my email there.
So,
James, I have a question for you.
Go ahead.
Could you please talk a little more about business analysis and business analyst careers going forward after this COVID-19?
I know we're going to run a bit over time, so feel free to drop off, folks, if I don't address the question quickly. So, business analysts have changed over time. Now, I talked about product managers and business analysts kind of being in the same space, but product management being a much broader one. So, business analysts, I find, usually transition to product managers. I still think there's a space for them in the current world and the post-COVID world. They have since suffered. So I know that in Lyft, in Uber, some of the big companies that have done layoffs in this time period, they were some of the first to go because people believe other folks can pick up the slack and do their role. So that's where it is, whereby it's a riskier place to be, and I find it as a nice stepping stone to get into product management as a whole. And those folks are worth their weight in gold. Now, in terms of what they actually do, in the product management life cycle, they usually carve out that space whereby we've decided we are going to build this app, this particular feature that's going to be able to do this. So we're going to add a search feature where people can search by name, search by city to find people, right? Now, they're going to take that statement and write out the requirements. Like, if someone enters this is what they should see in this particular place. If they enter this, they should show an error message in this corner, which says this. If they do it 3 times, log them out. That distillation of a product log line, like a simple statement, into something that developers can work through and read through is important. Now, most of the time, business analysts have to understand the domain quite well to see how well these things will play with the current app, the current way they'll use the app swap or the platforms work and all that. So to summarize, it's a subset of product management which is closer to the development team. I believe there's a space for them in a post-COVID world, but it's going to be riskier than some of the other roles in the software space. Did I answer that for you?
Yes, you did. Thank you.
All right. All right, folks, we are at time. I dropped my email there. If you do want a different form of communication, you can jump on WhatsApp as well, or whatever other medium. So just drop me a line and you can communicate whichever way you prefer.
Okay, thanks again, Oloo, for your time. I mean, we appreciate. I believe everybody has learned a lot. So I'll be sending. I've recorded the session, so that's shared by everybody as well as the slides. thanks, and